We're now looking to moving to formally capturing requirements, which means documentation. We need to write down at some point what our system should do for a variety of reasons, contractual, just simply for posterity's sake, so we know what we talked about. Mostly because we need to work through it with the project. We need to work with people. We have a social process here, building software. That means we all have to be on the same page. We need to refer back to this as we work through the rest of the system. I mean, we're going to see even in this class, testing highly, depends on the value of the quality of the requirements we have. And so we need to have the documents well captured so we can see the intent of them throughout the whole project. And so in order to capture requirements, we are coming to this with a viewpoint. So this is a little bit meta inside of here, but it is important to consider that whoever holds the pen tells the story. And even if you come in as a fairly unbiased observer, you still have some bias that you're leaking inside of there. And so one of the ways we can control that bias is to tell the story through a particular observer. So we want to talk about who is the observer, and then what's their role, perspective, or bias that's going into as we capture the requirements. And so the requirements have different approaches to be able to handle this. Now, the typical approach you've seen in software, and it's still used today, is this omniscient overvoice, the beneficial voice of a supreme being that tells you, the system shalt thou do these things. And there's some benefit to this. It's what we're used to seeing. It's very familiar to people in IT, and it's what's very common. We can attempt to capture a variety of perspectives inside of there. So we can say, the system shall receive information through a mobile application. And then another perspective is the mobile application shall not use the color red because that is offensive. And again, it's a bunch of different perspectives, and it's a little bit variable on those perspectives. But there is a way to capture all those little random details. We can write down any bit of details we want to, both functional and non-functional. The limitations, though, it's not great at really synthesizing those details. If I say the system, the website shall not be read, that means the only way to check that is literally go through every possible thing that shows up in the whole website and make sure it's not read. And the alternative is to capture screenshots and then look at them and say they're not read, and then that's good enough. Maybe someday you do want to go use red, so you have to go remove that requirement at that point. So it's different viewpoints. Again, it's not great at letting us manage those details, and it doesn't necessarily tell us how the system actually works. It's not great for telling a story, because if I get too narrative in those requirements, it's difficult to know what's really important and what's super critical. Because I could say something like, the login screen it contains username and password, and they're going to put it in buttons. And the login screen shouldn't use anything red because that's going to be error messages. And so they put the username and password and they get forward on the next screen. Well, shouldn't use anything red? Is that an absolute requirement? Shall not use anything red ever? Or it kind of implied the error messages might be read. So it becomes difficult to really discern what's important, what's not in that way. And so you can lean away from some of the details, or you can lean into some of the details. There's not a nice neutral boundary there. You can be really vague, or you can say the system shall use this database from this system, and that shall use this table, and that's way too much information. Detailed implementations specification inside of there. And so the approach that I'd like for you to learn, that I think is the better way to go, and is very common in industry as well, is something called use cases, where the idea of a use case is to capture the system from the perspective of the person using it, or the other system using it. Doesn't have to be a person. And so typically it's a user with a mouse and a keyboard interacting with the system. And we're going to talk about what are the different screens and actions and inputs and outputs that they're going to deal with. So we really just need to capture what the user sees. And this is fundamentally what requirements come up to, is what things do I do for the users and what do they see along the way of doing it. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect screens and every little bit of graphic design detail. We'll see how it goes, from there. But that's the idea: is instead of some omniscient over voice, we are getting a very specific user of who's benefiting from this. And it hopefully helps us keep us managing our detail level as well. So fundamentally, this is different because it gives us that big picture. We know that the software is built for users, and we know that they have specific value that they're going to provide, and they know they're going to have certain expectations of what the system does. And it also allows us to break up each one of those interactions separately. So we can give you a full story of what a user does and what value they receive, and then we can tell you many stories about what they do that may or may not have things in common. That's for implementation to decide, but we're not worried about how the system's built. We're just worried about what the system does for us. What value does the system add for us? And that's what we want to look at to capture here. So there's many different stories then that we can talk about within use cases. We don't have to have one big thick document that says this is what the system is. We can have several smaller documents. And we can have one that talks about buying life insurance, another that talks about buying auto insurance, another that talks about filing a claim, and another that talks about canceling a policy if you're dealing in the insurance space. And it's just one example. And so each one of those ends up being something that the user selects at a high level. They're done, as it says, at the user's whim, not something that I have to order or make those things happen. And so this is captured through the use case diagram. And we introduced this last week, but now we can talk a little bit more detail about what a use case diagram is. It is this interaction between a user and the system. And it tells one story that typically will take between 5 and 20 minutes. So it's not something that, like a login is sometimes a use case. It's not an interesting use case. I do that for 30 seconds and I'm done with it. So typically I want something that takes a little bit of time and particularly adds value to me. As a business, I've either made money or I've satisfied a user in their need in some interesting way. It's not a full picture of the system. This isn't supposed to tell me, the flow of all the pages. It doesn't even tell me all the pages within that one bit. It's just a menu to tell me what different things the user can have. And it can also tell me the different types of users I have out there. So in this case, I have buyers and sellers. There are different roles a user can play. So if you're talking about eBay, for instance, the things you can do as a buyer are very different than the things you can do as a seller. You can be both roles, but on a particular item, you're not both a buyer and a seller. So it's different things you can do based off of what your role is at the time. And so it's not a human that we're talking about here. It's not a specific person, a specific name. It's just a role you play over time in the system. And that system might have multiple partitions. We saw this one a little bit before. You can have a mobile app and a website. There's different places I can do different things. And those things might be the same thing, and it might be different things. The use cases here could be exactly the same, and they could be slightly altered because they're in different formats inside of there. But all of these capabilities in just the use case diagram help us really get to a more robust description of what the system is, but not be super detailed at this point. I'm not worried about what database it connected to. I don't need to see what backend system receives this data. This is just simply a story of when me, the user, sits down at the computer, what do I see? What can I do? What value do I get? Now, we don't stop there. Use cases are more than just a diagram. There's a lot of information I want to capture beyond the picture. We still need details of context. We still do need words to back this up. So the use case also provide a document with a specific structure that captures specific needs. And so the elements of a use case come up where we have the content, who are the people interacting with the system, the actors, and then what is the preconditions that they need to fulfill before they can do this use case. They have to be logged in, if you will. And what's the post condition? What do they expect after they finish this? And then we get into the functionality of a use case, which is what do they do when everything is happy, the primary flow, the happy flow, if you will. Nothing went wrong, no errors, they inputted everything properly. What does the flow look like? I see this page, I hit next. I see that page, I hit save. I see this other page, I hit exit, and then I'm done. The alternative flows is what are the different things that could happen. I see this, I hit save. I see this, I hit make it a recurring meeting. Okay, that's an alternative flow. It allows me to capture that separately. So I can see the basic use of the site and I can see advanced uses of the site. The exception flows tell me Okay, I hit save here, and it says, oh, this meeting is in conflict with another meeting. Okay, that's an exception flow. It doesn't happen every time, just sometimes, and this describes when that happens. And then business rules are the invariants. Like, hey, everybody must conform to this. All meetings must be between 9 and 5. You can't have meetings outside of that time or something like that. So here's an example of a use case. I'm not going to talk through it too much. You can pause this and read the exact details, but you can see we have a user, and the precondition is they must have created an account, and the postcondition is they saved some information. Going into primary flow, this is a step-by-step of what they do. This is the user does this, the system does that. Sometimes these are actually formatted in such a way where I say the system is presented with this, the user does that. I've done it in text here. Sometimes they do a table left and right, what the systems are doing back and forth. Here's an example of the alternative flow. You can see on step 3, this other thing could happen. Or the exception flow. On step 2, this error could happen, and this is what happens with it. It's not a flow chart. It doesn't have decisions inside of there where I can see them branch off, intentionally so. We want to keep it simple where we are trying to capture the exact flow of everything, but then take each side journey on its way. So think of it this way. If you're making a trip across the country, you can get a map from going from New York to LA, for instance, but you're probably going to stop along the way and eat and refuel and maybe stay at a hotel. Well, your directions just show New York to LA. It doesn't show you every one of those side stops, but you can make them. Your GPS can, your phone, whatever it's going to be, can say, oh, okay, you get off the highway now, go here. So the different ways to do it is I can either show you every single branch, every single place, every single flow, which is a lot of data, or I can let you deal with those one at a time. So when you get to Ohio and want to stop for a meal, okay, now do that separately, as opposed to having to plan that out in advance and read all of that in the initial flow. All right, so that's the strategy behind use cases. So the way we want to document use cases then is we have both the diagrams, which we probably have many diagrams, actually. We don't have just one use case diagram for the whole system. But we want to have a few users and a few features and a few systems we're talking about. Probably somewhere 7 plus or minus 3, so 5 to 10 type of things inside of there. Basically to tell a cohesive story, some aspect of the system. There might not be, a lot of information there, but it is telling us the context for a certain story. And then we back that up with documentation. So we could have one use case per document. We could have a few use cases in a document. Splitting them up saves on some editing and some management, but putting them together helps tell a more cohesive story. It's how you arrange them as your preference. But the idea here is now I'm getting beyond just a series of edicts, but into narratives and stories. So we're going to take a pause here and let you think about this. We'll come back to that other alternative way, the other traditional way. We're not going to ignore that. That's still a vital skill in running the document and capture requirements. But I really encourage you to think about use cases and how they are a great way to alternatively capture this information, and how practicing them now could give you a new skill to add to your repertoire as you get out into the industry.